Welcome to the Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and the working title for today's show is A Peek into the Energy Future Superabundance. My guest is Dr. Adam Dorr, who leads the research team for RethinkX, a think tank whose founders include Tony Seba, who we've interviewed a number of times, had Adam on a couple of times. So, welcome to the Energy Show, Adam.
Thanks, Markham. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited about this, okay, because when you guys released you talked about superabundance, solar, wind, and batteries 2, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. You released your first report. I'll be honest, I didn't get it. I just didn't understand the potential at that time. But there's been so many changes now in the last since then that the light bulb finally went on when I read this report, and I'm really excited. But before we get into the details, like how this superabundance works. I want to talk about disruption because that's your area of expertise. Disruption around the technology, around the global energy system. And I think, is it fair to say that we are already in a technology revolution?
Oh, absolutely. And the in our terms, using the theoretical framework that our team and Tony Seba have developed, this is no ordinary disruption either. The energy disruption is what we call a phase change disruption. In other words, there's more going on here than just a new kind of light bulb disrupting an older kind of light bulb. This is a situation where the entire system itself is going to be changed by the new technologies. The new system that emerges, the new energy system in this case, is going to have very different behaviors, very different properties, and as a result, it's going to support completely different kinds of business models, use cases, and different products and services are going to be built on top of this new system that were never possible before. And so what it requires, and I'm biased, it's right in our name, RethinkX, is a rethinking of humanity's relationship with energy. This is a big, big change, and it's absolutely correct. It's no exaggeration to call it a revolution.
Let's talk about the change because the example that you use and it resonates with me because back in the 90s we had a little company called Clio Communications and we tried to take advantage. We tried to use web conferencing and digital presentation technologies. We had a little business model, and we lived through that internet revolution. And going from dial up to broadband and all of these wonderful technology. But your point is that it wasn't the introduction of the internet, it was how the internet enabled new business models that added so much more value than
Right.
simply the selling of the internet to customers.
That's exactly right. So, I mean, for those of us who are old enough to remember, there was a time when making a phone call had a non-trivial
Oh,
cost. It had a high enough marginal cost that you paid for each individual call. You paid by the minute if it was long distance. In the very early days of mobile phones, you paid by the individual text message that you sent, and so on and so forth. With the internet and the digital revolution of telecommunications and information, the marginal cost of transmitting data, storing data, processing data fell so far, those costs plummeted so far that the marginal cost is now near zero. And as a result, it isn't telcos that have built trillions of dollars of value. It is all of the value from new businesses building on top of telco infrastructure that has been where the real value of the internet has emerged. And yes, those original telcos do still exist in some forms, and the infrastructure for telecommunications and information is essential. Of course it is. But the value creation is all built on top of that underlying infrastructure, on top of that kernel. And it will be exactly the same for energy.
and the best example of that from your point of view is Amazon and Amazon Web Services.
That's a great example. Yeah. So, and this is also something that we use to illustrate this concept of how superabundance emerges. We call it SWB, solar, wind, and batteries, superpower. It's sort of a fun play on words. But if I may, I'll use the example of Amazon Web Services to explain it. So Amazon Web Services uh, is a new business model that emerged from what was originally a problem for Amazon. So what Amazon had to do, they had no choice. They had to build their web infrastructure, their bandwidth, their storage, their transmission infrastructure, the amount of traffic they could handle on their website, and even some of their brick and mortar logistical assets. They had to build all of that to the peak season, to when demand was going to be highest, when the burden on their system was going to be largest in the holiday seasons, in the 3 or 4 weeks around the holidays, starting in the US Thanksgiving, running through Christmas, Hanukkah, New Year, and so on. Now, what that did is it left the entire rest of the year with this enormous latent capacity in their hardware, in their system. And rather than look at that and say, "Oh man, that's a problem, that's a waste," they saw it as an opportunity. They built a new business around that surplus capacity that was available for the overwhelming majority of the year. It was available, and that new business became Amazon Web Services. And Amazon Web Services is an astounding success in its own right. It's a tens of billions of dollars in revenue enterprise. If I'm not mistaken, I think huge giants like Netflix run on that on top of Amazon Web Services. So not only was it not a problem, not only was it not a merely a merely marginal or insignificant side effect or a nuisance or anything like that, it was an astounding opportunity that Amazon leveraged into enormous value. And so we think there's a profound lesson to learn there for the energy sector.
Yeah, I mean, think of all the business models that have been built on that. I mean, you mentioned Netflix. Streaming video now is taken as a given, but back when Blockbuster was blowing itself up by not recognizing the disruption that was Netflix. So 20 years ago, nobody had a clue. Nobody had a clue. But think now. I mean, we order a lot of our goods off Amazon, Temu, whatever the heck it is. We order get our videos. We get. I mean, how many other things are connected to the web in one way or another that are even if it's not a web-based, that's where you provide the value, like Netflix, but it enables other businesses because they can order on the web, you can communicate on the web, you can all of those kinds of things. It adds enormous value to other businesses.
Well, that's exactly right. And you used, I think, exactly the right word, which is enable. So in the process of building to the peak difficulty, so to the most challenging time whenever you're facing that. In the case of energy, this typically is the shortest days and the cloudiest days or weeks of winter. So that's the time of year that's most challenging for solar and for wind power and batteries. If you have an energy system based on those technologies, your most difficult time of the year is going to be then. If you build the system and you optimize it so that you've got the right mix of those three technologies, you're naturally going to have a surplus of solar power production and wind power production throughout all of the rest of the year. More than that, the batteries are going to allow you to utilize that electricity generation overnight as well, because you can see the charging profile a number of days ahead according to the weather. So if you have an abundance of sunshine and you know you're going to have it for 2 weeks, you can use the batteries overnight, draw them down, and know you're going to be able to recharge them. What does all this mean? It's very much like the Amazon Web Services example we gave you. It allows for a superabundance of very, very effectively near zero marginal cost electricity to emerge. And it has to emerge naturally anyway, because you had no choice but to size the system for the most challenging period. Okay, what does that do? Well, that infrastructure ends up enabling for all of the rest of the year, and not just a few hours, all day long, weeks and weeks on end, all season. It allows you to find other uses for near zero marginal cost electricity. And the opportunity that represents for entire societies, for human civilization, is staggering. And that is what we've struggled, frankly, for 5 years to fully come to understand and appreciate ourselves on my team, and now communicate to everybody else that it really is the enabling condition. The enabling condition of energy superabundance is going to be transformative, not just for energy, but for civilization writ large.
I think it's fair to say that the internet has already done that, and we can argue.
Absolutely, it has.
We could
Yeah.
argue about the utility of social media platforms, but that's been a two-edged sword for sure. But really, that is the model because 30 years ago we thought of telcos as just communication platforms. That's all it
Right.
was, and they have become something entirely different. And if
Right.
that's the model for the energy system that we're going for, then what we have to look forward to, because energy has essentially been the vehicle by which civilization advanced itself, from dung and wood and all of those primitive, 2,000 years ago through that up to today. And so the opportunity to advance civilization and energy poverty, bring people's lifestyles up to a better standard, all of that gets enabled by this.
That's exactly right. So one of the things that one of the most, I think, important implications that's emerged out of our growing understanding of how superpower creates clean energy superabundance is precisely the fact that the status quo today, and certainly any time prior to the present moment, for humanity at large has been unacceptable. It hasn't been good enough. Yes, there are those of us privileged enough to live in the wealthy societies and frankly the wealthy communities in the wealthy societies of the world who've enjoyed energy abundance and all of the extraordinary prosperity that enables. But that is not everyone on Earth. There are literally billions of people who don't have enough energy. They certainly don't have the energy necessary that's either available or affordable that would allow the kind of prosperity, shared prosperity, to emerge that everyone, every human being on Earth deserves. This new energy system, a system built on clean energy superabundance, can deliver that for the first time, and in a way that doesn't come at a terrible cost, and that doesn't force us to make excruciating trade-offs with other things we care about, like the integrity of the ecological systems around the world, like the social dimensions where energy is produced or utilized today that causes air pollution, for example. So a clean, superabundant energy future is one that elevates everybody into prosperity. And I can think of no more important implication than that.
One of the things that we've argued here at Energy Media that gets us into trouble with our friends in the climate community is they see the the crisis as a moral issue. And we argue that no, it's really a technology and markets issue. And if you want to solve the issue of greenhouse gas emissions, don't focus on the emissions, focus on the new system that you're building. And you are
Right.
talking about the new system that is being built. And and so one of the unintended consequences of building the system you're talking about, the superabundant system, is now all of a sudden all those fossil fuel burning, coal and oil and gas, it just disappears. It accomplishes the goals that the climate activists want to accomplish, but without focusing on policies and changes in lifestyle and all of those things that they're demanding.
That's exactly right. And we've seen this before. There are environmental success stories. We've had triumphs. They're things that we take for granted now because the problems were solved so completely. You might say they were dissolved. They vanished from our attention. Things like sanitation and clean potable water that's safe to drink solved terrible environmental challenges that were perennial for humanity up until the 20th century. So as far as environmental hazards or risks go, unsafe water, unsanitary water was a massive risk, and it still is. By the way, several million people, mostly children around the world, die because of a lack of water and sanitation services. Energy played a huge role in enabling that solution to that particular environmental problem. Acid rain is another one, where acid rain was in my lifetime certainly it emerged as a problem that was very serious. We didn't appreciate it soon enough. We realized it was a major problem, and we were able to solve it with technological innovation. And does run contrary to the existing, the prevailing wisdom and much of the environmental discourse, um, to say that humanity is going to use more energy in the future than it does today. But I would say misconception is it does emerge from being stuck in the box of the status quo, of the energy status quo, being unable to see past the unwanted side effects that are coupled to the old technologies, and to realize that the real way to solve the problem is not to put band-aids on the existing system, not to try to use fossil fuels a little bit less, or to find ways to get around the problems, or to clean up the messes they create, but to find alternatives to them altogether. And that's what we're going to do with this disruption.
We've done a lot of work with Professor Nick Ayer's scholarship out of Oxford, where he talks about how if the fossil fuel industry, combustion is inefficient. Does combustion coal, oil, and gas, it just is inherently inefficient. Whereas electricity technologies are inherently much more efficient, 2 to 3, 4 times as efficient.
Right.
So it's a paradox, or it sounds like a paradox, but we may use a pile more electricity by 2050 or 2100, 2200, but we'll use a lot less energy because we're not wasting energy. We're making better use of the energy we create.
Well, I think that it's very difficult to see too far out into the future. Oh, so much is going to change. There are a lot of moving parts. So there's a bit of a horizon that's very difficult to see beyond. But I would certainly say that on the time frame of 15 to 20 years, energy consumption by humanity as a whole is virtually certain to rise. But that's a good thing. And even though the new technologies are more efficient, that is absolutely true. Um, the the consequences, the harmful consequences, in other words, what economists would call the externalities, social and environmental and otherwise, that are associated with older energy technologies, whether it's the greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution caused by combustion fuels, fossil fuels, or whether it's the inherent risks of nuclear fission technologies, certainly the older nuclear fission technologies. Um, those when we decouple those harmful consequences from energy utilization, then we can just look at the energy utilization itself and evaluate it on its own merits. And on its own merits, energy is good. Energy is a marvelous thing for humanity. Not only that, if we have more energy available to us, we're empowered by that energy to do more, for example, environmental restoration than we would otherwise be able to do. If we're more prosperous, we have more incentive and more means to protect and restore the environment that's been damaged in the past. So I think overwhelmingly we're likely to use more energy net in the future, even though we will be generating it more efficiently on a per unit basis. But there will be an absolute plummeting off a cliff of the harmful consequences associated with that energy use as we disrupt, and then as fossil fuel use and other conventional uses of energy are abandoned.
Right. And I guess what I was getting at here I was simply wanted to highlight the greater efficiency of electricity. And Nick's work is really about it's theoretical. So if you had X amount of work that you needed to get done, would you need more energy or less energy if you switched to electricity? Well, he would say less. But what you're
Less, that's
saying
right.
is the superabundance system enables way more work to be done. Because
Correct.
it creates other business models. It extends the market reach with more consumers now than there previously were. So I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole because the ideas sound incompatible at first blush, but in fact they're not. They're quite compatible. Anyway, we're going to move on from that. One of the things I wanted to have you explain. I'll be honest with you, I'm not an economist. And this idea of the U curve and some of the economics around it, I still am struggling with it a bit. So maybe you could explain it for us.
Sure. So one of the fascinating, it was the thrill of a scientific career, I have to say, 5 years ago, was our team's discovery of what we call the clean energy U curve, and it is a very unintuitive finding. So for any system, any energy system that's based primarily on solar, wind, and batteries, you have to pick a combination of those three technologies to go together in order to have a system that meets your energy needs all day, all night, all year round. Now, it turns out that there are many different combinations of those three technologies of solar, wind, and batteries that can get the job done. Many different many different mixes are viable. So then one has to ask the question, how do you discern between different combinations? One part wind, one part solar, 10 parts batteries, or vice versa. How do you discern between them? Well, we analyzed the cost structure of those different combinations. And so the U curve, what we discovered is a U-shaped cost function. So imagine a chart with a U shape, and the vertical axis, the Y-axis, is how much the system costs. And every point on the curve is a different combination of solar and wind and batteries together that gets the job done. It can meet all of your electricity needs at that most challenging time of year, those shortest days of winter. But those different combinations are not all the same cost. Some are much more expensive than others. And why the U shape? Well, what it turns out that some combinations have lots and lots and lots of solar panels and wind turbines. And when you have loads of generating capacity, you can even generate electricity during the wintertime on those short days. So you don't need as much battery capacity. That's one side of the curve, but those systems are expensive. They're not optimal. On the other side of the curve, you can flip the mix around and you can say, well, we don't have to have all that much solar and wind, maybe only a little bit more, nameplate capacity than we already have installed in coal and gas and nuclear and hydropower. But we would have to absolutely load up on the batteries so that we could charge weeks and weeks and weeks worth of batteries up in order to get us through the winter period, because we just don't have that much solar and wind capacity in that challenging time. So that's the other side of the U curve, and those combinations are very, very expensive. And somewhere in the middle, there's a sweet spot where it's the lowest cost system. And so that was a very unintuitive pattern to discover because it's nonlinear, and nonlinearity is something that our minds intuitively don't grasp very well. One last point that I'll add very, very quickly to say is that part of the trouble there is that these are moving targets. So whenever you're analyzing costs, what cost do you use? The cost today, or the cost 5 years from now, or 10 years from now? Because the costs of solar and wind and batteries are dropping fast. So we also had to factor that in. And then what we discovered is that the lowest cost system is very affordable. It's the cheapest. It's much cheaper than conventional systems when you look 5 to 10 years out. And these are systems like the Amazon's Web Services example we talked about, where you end up having a large surplus of solar and wind generating capacity on hand for most of the rest of the year. And that gives you superpower.
I want to use the example of the province where I live in British Columbia on the west coast of Canada, and because we have almost 100% hydro in this province, and the government-owned utility, BC Hydro, has determined that they are not going to build any. They've got one dam that's just coming to completion. That'll be the last one they ever build. And what they're doing now is they're putting out calls for independent power producers for wind, solar, whatever you can produce that's clean and cheap and reliable. And so this is a case where this is a particular type of electricity system. It's got a lot of hydro generation capacity, which can act as functionally as a battery for wind and solar. And so the combination of technologies here to get to superabundance would be very different than the province next door, which has very little hydro. Would be Alberta, but they do have a lot of coal, or sorry, not coal, gas. They went from coal to gas, but they do also have a lot of wind and solar. We have great resources, so the best in Canada. That would have another combination. And then you add another layer of complexity on here, is that there's a big movement in Canada now to link power systems, the grids, east and west. So now BC and Alberta can trade their electricity back and forth as required, which then maybe lowers the need for batteries even more. But you can, given the resources you have, you engineer the optimal system.
Right.
Which is your point, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And it does look very different from region to region. In our new Understanding the Stellar Energy report that we've just published, we provide more than a dozen regional case studies as examples to show, to highlight some of the variety that we see around the world. And that variety, as a result, it's a combination of geographic factors and that change weather and the availability of solar and wind as a function of weather around the over the course of the year, and there are different demographic uh, uh, contexts. Some countries have sparse populations. Some countries have very dense populations. And so there's a great deal of regional variety around the world. But what we found is that solar, wind, and batteries is viable everywhere that human beings live, even at very high latitudes. So it works in Alaska, it works in Norway, and it doesn't just work right on the equator. And superpower, this surplus, this same pattern, just like the Amazon Web Services example, we see that emerging everywhere. But there are differences, and it is going to be a mix of different technologies. Also, it's worth pointing out that if there are legacy technologies that exist in a location, hydropower, even older nuclear power plants, there's no reason to pull those offline with any urgency. They can be part of the mix. What doesn't make sense is to keep operating high marginal cost and high environmental and social cost conventional technologies like coal and gas when there is a better economic option available, a cheaper option available. And in many instances, we see that a solar plus batteries installation, for example, is cheaper to build new and then operate at near zero marginal cost for the next 50 years than to keep shoveling coal into an old coal power plant. In other words, the cost of a new solar and battery system can be lower than the cost of operating an existing coal plant, in which case it makes sense to shut the coal down. But that may not be the case if you've got a perfectly good hydropower installation or a perfectly good nuclear power plant online. It doesn't make sense to take those offline. So it is going to be a different mix in different places.
And I want to get back to the BC Alberta comparison for a moment because this is where a lot of the debate is taking place in Canada. And Alberta has an enormous amount of industry, heavy industry, refining, petrochemicals, manufacturing, that kind of thing. And one of the things we know is that many of those fossil fuel based industries can be converted to electricity now, or soon will be in the future. So if you go to this kind of a system, you're enabling them to have lower input costs. You're enabling them to become more competitive as emissions intensity of products becomes more of get priced in the market through carbon taxes or cap and trade systems. You give those products another cost advantage, competitive advantage. And all we have to do is look east to Quebec, where they've got massive hydro resources. And so what have they done? They've imported bauxite ore, and they make aluminum out of it. And really, it's the cheap, clean, abundant electricity that enables all of that aluminum manufacturing. Without that, there is no aluminum manufacturing in Canada. We're essentially exporting electricity in the form of aluminum, and mostly down to you guys. Or we were until President Trump put silly tariffs on it, but maybe those are going to come off. But the aluminum industry in Quebec seems to illustrate exactly what you're talking about. Cheap, clean, abundant electricity enables new business models, and there's one that we've had now for years.
Well, that's what we are encouraging every region to start asking itself. What would you do with a superabundance of clean electricity that didn't have costly externalities, where the electricity itself could be generated at near zero marginal cost, and that was available overwhelmingly all throughout the year, with some seasonal patterns. And part of our new analysis shows what those patterns are. So it's important to understand those. But the key question to ask is, what could you do? And what we're discovering is that there's a natural instinct. It's sort of a one-dimensional thinking to reach for one individual sort of killer application at a time. Okay, we've got what would I do with clean electricity in unlimited surplus of it? Okay, well, I'm going to try to find this one use of it that would be the basis of a new business model. And that's perfectly fine. That's fair. That's not incorrect. And those uses may be something like heavy industry. So metal refining and recycling is a good example. the electrification of currently very energy intensive processes like ammonia production, cement production, steel production. These are ripe for conversion to electricity. So electrification, especially if that electricity is very near zero marginal cost. AI is another one that, of course, that's now rising in prominence and awareness that we're going to need an enormous amount of electricity for AI. But what our team believes is that the real key for new business models is not to look for individual killer apps, but to look for killer combos. So where can you combine two, three, maybe even four businesses together in shared synergistic utilization of clean, superabundant electricity? So, for example, you could pair an AI data center or supercomputing cluster that needs enormous amount of electricity, who's generating low grade, not super high temperature waste heat as its waste stream. That if you're a business that can utilize low grade heat, like for example precision fermentation or brewing or biotech or something like that, then pair with that data center, and then you can have a combo utilization of that clean energy. And that is we think is where the new business models are going to emerge that are the most successful.
I'm glad you brought up the idea of AI, like of data centers and AI in particular, because I had an energy economist on here, Ed Hurst, not too long ago. And we were talking about the Trump tariffs, and Canada at that time was contemplating strategies to, respond to those. And Ed said, well, why don't you guys have all this great, clean, cheap electricity up there? Why don't you come down to the United States, lure away all of our data center projects, put them up in Quebec or Ontario or BC or Manitoba, and then take the electricity you were exporting to the U.S. and use it for the data centers. That would send a message to President Trump. But I got a lot of pushback from viewers who said, well, data centers, I mean, that's kind of a low value. And another viewer came on, and he said, look, data centers are not in and of themselves an industry it's all of what it enables. That's the key with
That's right.
data centers and with AI. And next thing you know, you've got these clusters around data centers, and it might be greenhouses or whatever can use the low cost heat. But it also might be app developers, and it might be software developers, and it might be who knows. I mean, that's one of those industries that needs what's the word I'm looking at? I was going to say facilitation, but you I think you understand my point. And it blossoms from there. If you put in that infrastructure, that then enables all of these new business models to emerge.
I think that's absolutely correct. So intelligence is what you're really talking about building, what you're really talking about producing on an ongoing basis, not just one time, but on an ongoing basis from whether you call it a data center or a computing cluster or any whatever it happens to be, and at any different scale. So you could, yes, we're seeing right now very, very large, consolidated, enormous scale installations going in. We're hearing about these in the United States especially, but in other parts of the world as well. But like energy and like water, the production, the generation of intelligence is one of the foundational, one of the ultimate enabling conditions for creating other valuable things, other valuable goods and services, other valuable elements of prosperity. And like energy, like clean water that you can depend on, like transportation infrastructure, roads where you can actually get from A to B safely and consistently and at very, very low cost, the infrastructure for intelligence is going to be one of the fundamental enabling conditions for civilization going forward. And just as we don't regret having fresh water capacity so that anytime you need it, anybody can get it, and in plenty, not in scarce, a drop or two at a time and a very high cost, but where you can really get as much water as you need. Same with electricity, and same with intelligence. Okay, and so is anybody going to regret building the capacity to generate intelligence as an enabling condition for everything else that they want to do, every other form of value creation, economic and otherwise, they want their society to be capable of? No, you're not going to regret that. It's only going to be an enabling condition for the things that really matter that we're going to build on top of it.
There's an approach here with the superabundance idea that is we need to talk about, and it's particularly relevant within the Canadian context because we're having this. We're the biggest importer of oil and gas to the United States, or the exporter, sorry, and the the tariff that Trump has put on has now got us thinking about, oh my God, we need to consume more of it domestically, but more important, we need to export to new markets like China and India and so on. But people, like what I'm saying is that will require, everybody agrees that's going to require subsidies, federal government subsidy. Now we have we're a small country of 40 million people. We don't have unlimited capital. We need to spend our capital wisely. So are we better off investing that capital in old energy infrastructure that might become a stranded asset in a decade, or better off spending it on wind and solar and batteries and transmission and market design and all of that kind of stuff? Now, here's where I'm going with this lead up. The technologies you're talking about, unlike the fossil fuel is CapEx and then ongoing OpEx and fuel costs. That's basically how it works. The system you're talking about is higher CapEx, more capital expenditures, but then you've got technology, basically infrastructure, that for 30 to 50 years, with minimal OpEx, minimal maintenance, basically produces almost free electricity. And you have to spend more to get greater benefit down the road. And it's often the higher capex that acts as a limiter on consumers or governments being able to do that.
Well, that is true. I would point to the fact that the capex is falling, and it's still falling fast.
Sure.
Right. So it was absolutely true 10 or 15 years ago that the capex of solar and wind and batteries was far greater. It greatly exceeded the comparative capex of a new gas turbine, combined cycle gas turbine of similar generating capacity, for example. So if you were willing to ignore all of the operating and fuel costs for the next 50 years, then yes, if for just the capital expenditure alone, the capex, then it was tough. Your SWB looked more expensive. But as we look out over 5, 10, 15 years ahead, those capex numbers are converging too. Now, again, it depends on where and it depends on when, but that difference is now that gap is closing so much that we're really approaching no-brainer territory. If you can pay a little bit of a premium in upfront cost and get the operating cost down basically to zero indefinitely. I mean, and you said 30 to 50 years, and I really appreciate that, Markham. There's a widely held false assumption that solar and wind and batteries only last for a decade or two, and that's simply not the case. These are assets that are good for 50 years of operational life. Even the batteries, by the way, the latest generation, the latest chemistries are very long lived when they're operated within the right parameter space. So the idea that we're basically front loading, we're basically prepaying the next 50 plus years of electricity out of these assets, that does change the game completely. Now, to your other question, should Canada be thinking about continuing to stay in the oil and gas game so that there's an opportunity to continue pulling in revenues and have that industry continue to thrive, as opposed to letting it go with disruption? I think there's an argument to be had for a soft landing there. I don't think that I would or anyone on my team would advocate for just an absolute abrupt, catastrophic collapse of that industry because of the social cost that would have. However, you don't want to go down with the sinking ship. And that is what is going to happen to fossil fuels. You don't want to peg your future to that. any more than we wanted to peg our future to celluloid film processing and 1 hour photo development studios when you were in the imaging business. No, you wanted to embrace digital technologies and digital imaging because that was the future. And you don't want to go down with the ship. That's not a losing, or sorry, that's not a winning strategy. That's a losing strategy. But we can find a way to do a soft landing for that so that it doesn't happen overnight. This is something we phase out of in a reasonable and frankly humane way. That's what we need to do.
Okay, 2 points. I brought up the idea of higher capex versus lower opex for the superabundance system because not because to dampen the argument for it, but simply to make the point that both citizens and policymakers and the business community need to change their thinking about it. We're still stuck in old ways of thinking about energy. And as somebody who's been in the, participating in the Canadian energy conversation for 15 years, I can tell you the majority of the country is still locked into that old, coal, oil, and gas way of thinking about energy. This stuff is completely radical and new for 99.95% of the Canadian population. That's the first point. The second point is Canada is in a very unique position because 70% of our oil production is bitumen from the northern Alberta oil sands. And this is not widely known, but bitumen is a wonderful feedstock for materials manufacturing. And in fact, if you take a $50 barrel of bitumen and you turn it into carbon fiber, the value you get from a barrel is now $233. The craziest thing we could do is burn bitumen. The craziest, the lowest value thing. You can turn it into asphalt binder for roads. You can turn it into activated carbon for batteries. You can do a whole bunch of things, but the lowest value is to sell it to a refinery. But systems get built up over decades, and we keep doing the thing that we've always done because we made money at it, and who wants the risk of changing, all of that. We need to embrace the idea that the global energy system is changing. We need new ways of thinking, and this is, I first interviewed Tony in 2017 about his robotaxi study. And everybody went, yeah, it's that Seba guy, he's selling snake oil. And then I had Tony back on 3 years ago, and we said, well, yeah, of course, my predictions aren't going to come true exactly the way I said them, but the general arc is in his favor. We will get to robo-taxis a lot quicker, maybe not 2030, but 2035, whatever. And that's the way we have to approach superabundance. This idea system you're talking about here is that the benefits that you've outlined here now we as a society, I'm talking about Canada specifically here, need to embrace it, think about it, invest in it, expand it, change our laws, our regulations. All of this is a major sea change. If we do it, we get the benefits. If not, not so much.
No, that's exactly right. And so I agree with you across the board. And I will just add one additional an extra set of dimensions to think about. Okay. And that is that because you mentioned Tony, a major part of Tony's framework and the way that Tony is able to be closer to the truth with these forecasts and predictions that he makes and that our team makes working with him as our founder of RethinkX is that it's a convergence of multiple technologies together that drives these patterns that we see. It's very, very rarely a single technology in isolation. If it's only one technology in isolation, it's much more likely that will simply be a substitute. It'll drop in and swap out something something that was less capable or more expensive. But an individual technology is less likely to cause systemic transformation. What we see instead for these transformative events is a convergence of multiple technologies together. So in the case of robotaxis, with and again, Tony was the first person that I'm aware of in going back before 2014 before his original book that discussed this, Clean Disruption. He talked about the convergence, just in the case of robotaxis as an example. He talked about the convergence of electric vehicles, and especially batteries, making those possible, together, converging together with artificial intelligence, which would allow them to be self-driving, together with the networking and peer-to-peer ride-hailing services for on-demand mobility that the internet made possible, which wouldn't have been possible at all prior to the internet. It was the convergence of those three factors that really sets the stage for a transformation of the energy system. And so, yes, robotaxis is the right way to think about it, but their impact is going to be much greater than just, you get a fancier car. Transportation itself will change. Our relationship to mobility will change if the vehicles are clean and they can drive themselves, right? That is going to be a profound system transformation. Okay, it's the same with energy. And let me expand it just a little bit further, because you mentioned the Canadian economy. Okay, how do we put all of this together? Well, it isn't enough just to think about energy. You've got to think about energy and transportation, and how food is going to be disrupted, and especially how labor is going to be disrupted. And again, this 10 years ago, this sounded like crazy science fiction when you talked about artificial intelligence 10 years ago. That sounded bananas. It sounded like, you got your head in a science fiction show or something. But now we can all see and feel this every day with the new AI that's around. And 5 years from now, it will be the same with robotics. Right now, it still feels a bit like science fiction, and there's just a bit of, clunky things walking around in labs somewhere. But 5 years from now, it'll be a different story, and we will be feeling about robotics the same way that we feel about AI today, and share that same experience, right? 5 years ago, nothing but incredulity and doubts and naysaying. Fast forward 5 years, it just is real, and it's here, and we're getting used to it in a big hurry. Okay, how do you put all of that together? Well, you have to think about those all in the context of one another, those converging technologies. And that is the real challenge for economic foresight and economic planning for any region.
Yeah, I want to wrap up the interview with this question, Adam. That was a very good segue into the question. And a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed a fellow named Oscar Ioffa, who's from Costa Rica. He's come to the University of Illinois, and he's an engineer. And what he's doing in Costa Rica is absolutely brilliant. He says, look, we don't have to make all the technologies. We're happy to have China make solar panels and inverters and all the things that enable us to go to a manufacturing operation in Costa Rica and say, we're going to build you a system that will lower your electricity costs, give you 99.99% uptime, and provide all these other benefits that come with, and we're going to do it by we bring the integration of these technologies. We're going to build a system for you that has our software and some of our hardware, and then all of this cheap Chinese technology we can almost, buy off the shelf. It's the integration. That's the brilliance of it. And the more I think about it, I understand why the US is worried about supply chains from China, because in the event of a hot war, you can't be relying on your enemy for things like batteries, right? So you have to have some of your own supply chain. I get that. But the brilliance of Oscar's model is that you take all of these really smart people in the West, in North America. Canada, Alberta has more engineers per capita than just about any place on the planet, aside from China. You put them to work and you say, look, okay, the equipment's going to come from here and here and here, and you're going to put it all together and make it work for the business model, for these various business models. And then we're going to supply all this cheap electricity. And that seems to be the enabler, that integration.
Oh, I think that's absolutely one of the winning formulas that we're going to see for sure. Now, it may not be the only one. I think that there are a lot of ways, there are a lot of paths to success here. In fact, I think if anything, that's probably the larger lesson that the internet taught us over the last 30 years, and that we ought to expect looking forward over the next 30, right? Is that there's so many different new possibilities that open up. It isn't that there's one way to do things, and yes, we did see a handful of big winners emerge out of the internet. So everybody knows about Google and Amazon and Facebook and so forth. But the internet opened the door. It made possible tens of millions of new enterprises, each of them creating value in its own ways. And most of that is built through integrating, pulling together elements from disparate sources. The fact that you've got a completely new environment, a completely new playing field in which where it's level enough and elevated enough that you can recombine, you can draw together these elements and build new things. That is what's so thrilling. That's what's so exciting. And the countries that have led on that have that's redounded to their success enormously. Having said that, it's in general it's a race to the top, and we've just seen this over the last 30 years with the internet. The overwhelming majority of the world now has internet access. The overwhelming majority of the world has benefited from the value that the internet has allowed humanity to create. I think it's going to be the same again with this energy disruption. And I think we're very likely to see exactly what you talked about and 100 other ways of succeeding, right? And now the integration pathway is almost certainly going to be a standout way to succeed, for sure. But we've seen great success with vertical integration, with just owning the entire stack. That's a winning formula too. So it isn't really either or. I think this is very much a yes and virtually all of the above. And so when I take a sort of a 35,000 foot view on this kind of transformation, we started the conversation by saying this is an energy transformation. When I look at it from that high level view, what I see are the possibilities that are opening up. And that is the thing to get excited about. I would be very wary. Don't trust me or anybody else to make exactly correct predictions now, any more than in 1995 we could have predicted the exact winners or the right formulas or exactly what would happen with the internet. But what you could say with absolute confidence in 1995 is a whole new world is opening up. And enormous value is going to be created. And it is going to be value that's broadly shared. Loads of people creating that value, and virtually everyone on the planet benefiting from that value. And so what's the right reaction? What's the right response to that kind of opportunity, that kind of transformation? Get in the game. That's the response. That's the right attitude. Get in the game and start building and making new things. That's where the excitement is. That's where the value for you and yourself, your neighbors, your community, your society, and the world is.
Adam, that's a perfect ending to this interview. Thank you very much for this.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.